October 23, 1935, Newark, New Jersey. The Palace Chop House sits quiet in the fading light of evening, a modest tavern where working men gather for drinks and the illusion of normalcy. But tonight, normalcy dies. Inside, at a corner table, sits Arthur Flegenheimer, better known to the world as Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent and unpredictable crime bosses the underworld has ever known. He's surrounded by his most trusted men, counting money, making plans, unaware that 3 assassins are already walking through the door. Within minutes, bullets will tear through flesh and bone. Within hours, Dutch Schultz will lie in a hospital bed, his mind fracturing, speaking in riddles and madness as death slowly claims him. And at the center of this execution, pulling strings from the shadows, stands the man who changed organized crime forever. Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern American mafia, the man who built the commission, the man who understood that Dutch Schultz had become too dangerous to live. This is not just the story of a murder. This is the story of how one calculated betrayal saved the entire criminal underworld from destruction. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano sacrificed a fellow crime lord to protect a structure bigger than any single man. And this is the story of how that decision, cold and ruthless as it was, created the blueprint for organized crime that would dominate America for generations. To understand why Dutch Schultz had to die screaming in a hospital bed, speaking gibberish that would become infamous, we must first understand the world that Lucky Luciano built and the threat that Dutch posed to everything. The year is 1935 and America is deep in the heart of the Great Depression. Millions are unemployed, desperate, hungry. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed fortunes overnight and left the country in ruins. But while legitimate businesses crumbled, one industry exploded with unprecedented growth and profit. Crime, specifically organized crime. The Prohibition era, which began in 1920 with the Volstead Act banning alcohol, created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Suddenly, every speakeasy, every illegal bar, every underground casino needed suppliers. Every corner of every city had customers desperate for booze, gambling, and escape from their miserable reality. And into this vacuum stepped men who understood opportunity when they saw it. Men like Lucky Luciano. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, Luciano arrived in New York as a child, landing in the desperate poverty of the Lower East Side. He was 9 years old when his family settled in America, and by age 10 he was already running protection rackets on Jewish kids in his neighborhood. That's where he met Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, 2 Jewish boys who would refuse to pay and instead would become his lifelong partners. This alliance, this willingness to work across ethnic lines would become Luciano's signature. While older mafiosi clung to old-world traditions, Sicilian codes, and ethnic divisions, Luciano saw something else. He saw business, pure, calculated, rational business. He understood that money has no ethnicity, that power respects only results, and that the future belonged to those who could organize, cooperate, and think beyond petty tribal loyalties. By the 1920s, Luciano was rising fast through the ranks of New York's criminal underworld. He worked for Joe Masseria, one of the old guard Sicilian bosses who controlled much of Manhattan's Italian rackets. But Masseria represented everything Luciano despised about the old ways. Masseria was engaged in a brutal war with Salvatore Maranzano, another traditional Sicilian boss, in what became known as the Castellamarese War. This conflict, which raged from 1930 to 1931, was senseless, bloody, and bad for business. Men were dying in the streets. Operations were disrupted, money was being lost, and for what? Pride, territory, old-world grudges that meant nothing to the new generation. Luciano watched this chaos and made a decision that would change everything. He would end the old ways forever. On April 15, 1931, Luciano arranged to have lunch with Joe Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro. They ate, they talked, and then Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, 4 gunmen entered and shot Masseria to death. The gunmen were believed to include Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, and Joe Adonis. All men loyal to Luciano. All men who understood that the future required blood. Masseria's death ended the Castellamarese War, but Luciano wasn't finished. Maranzano, thinking he had won, declared himself boss of all bosses and attempted to establish himself as absolute ruler of the American Mafia. He lasted 4 months. In September 1931, Luciano had Maranzano killed, sending Jewish assassins posing as federal agents into Maranzano's office, where they stabbed and shot him to death. In 1 year, Luciano had eliminated both old guard bosses and fundamentally restructured organized crime in America. He created something that had never existed before. The Commission, a board of directors for the American Mafia, representatives from the 5 families of New York, plus seats for Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities. Disputes would be settled by vote, not by war. Territories would be respected. Business would be conducted rationally. Violence would be strategic, not emotional. This was Luciano's genius. He didn't just seize power. He created a system of power that could outlast any single man. He built an organization that functioned like a corporation with rules, hierarchies, and protocols. He brought order to chaos and transformed the mafia from scattered street gangs into a national criminal syndicate. But there was one problem, one significant, violent, unpredictable problem. Dutch Schultz, Arthur Fliegenheimer, born in the Bronx in 1902 to German Jewish immigrant parents, had built one of New York's most profitable criminal empires. He controlled the beer rackets in the Bronx and much of Harlem. He ran the numbers game, the illegal lottery that thousands of poor black and immigrant workers played daily, dreaming of hitting it big. He operated restaurants, nightclubs, and union rackets. At his peak, Dutch Schultz was bringing in millions of dollars annually, making him one of the wealthiest gangsters in America. But wealth didn't make him sophisticated. It didn't make him patient, and it certainly didn't make him controllable. Dutch Schultz was brutal, paranoid, and notoriously cheap despite his millions. He was famous for violence that was excessive even by gangster standards. He once beat a man to death with a shovel. He hung another victim on a meat hook and left him to die slowly. When someone crossed him, Dutch didn't just kill them. He made it theatrical, vicious, a message written in blood and suffering. This brutality made him feared, but it also made him unpredictable. And unpredictability was the one thing Lucky Luciano's new commission could not tolerate. The entire point of the commission was to bring rationality to organized crime, to make violence a tool of last resort, not a default response. Dutch Schultz represented chaos in a world Luciano was trying to order. The conflict between Dutch Schultz and the commission began with a man named Thomas Dewey. Thomas Edmund Dewey was a young, ambitious prosecutor appointed as special prosecutor to investigate organized crime in New York City. Dewey was smart, incorruptible, and absolutely relentless. He was going after the mob with unprecedented aggression, securing indictments, flipping witnesses, and building cases that could actually stick. Lucky Luciano himself would eventually be convicted by Dewey in 1936 on prostitution charges and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for compulsory prostitution. But in 1935, Dewey was building his cases, and Dutch Schultz was one of his primary targets. Dewey indicted Dutch on federal tax evasion charges, the same charges that had brought down Al Capone just a few years earlier. Dutch went into hiding, but eventually surrendered and went to trial twice. The first trial in Syracuse ended in a hung jury. The second trial, also in upstate New York, resulted in an acquittal after Dutch ran an expensive public relations campaign, donating to charities and presenting himself as a misunderstood businessman. He beat the tax charges, but Dewey didn't stop. Dewey was preparing more indictments, digging deeper into Dutch's operations, threatening to bring down not just Dutch, but potentially expose connections to other crime families. And Dutch, never known for patience or strategic thinking, had a solution. He would kill Thomas Dewey. Dutch brought his plan to the commission. He argued that killing Dewey would solve everyone's problems. With Dewey dead, the prosecutions would slow down, the heat would decrease, and everyone could go back to making money in peace. But the commission saw something Dutch couldn't see. They saw the catastrophe that would follow. Thomas Dewey was a public figure, a prosecutor, a man with political connections and public support. Killing him wouldn't end investigations. It would unleash them. Every law enforcement agency in America would descend on organized crime with fury. The FBI, which had largely ignored the mafia, would have no choice but to act. Politicians would demand action. The entire comfortable arrangement, the corruption, the bribes, the look-the-other-way deals, all of it would collapse. The commission understood what Dutch did not. Some people are too important to kill. Some targets bring more heat than the problem they solve. Lucky Luciano and the commission voted unanimously against the hit on Dewey. They ordered Dutch to stand down, to take his legal problems like everyone else, to accept that killing a prosecutor was off limits. But Dutch Schultz, violent and paranoid and convinced of his own judgment, refused. He told the commission he would kill Dewey with or without their approval. He was moving forward with his plan. He had already arranged surveillance on Dewey. He knew Dewey's routines, his routes, his habits. The hit was being organized. And in that moment, Dutch Schultz signed his own death warrant. The commission faced a choice: allow Dutch to kill Dewey and bring destruction upon the entire underworld, or eliminate Dutch and send a message that would echo for generations. The commission was not a democracy where everyone got to do as they pleased. It was an organization with rules, and those rules meant something. Lucky Luciano, as the dominant voice on the commission, made the call. Dutch Schultz had to die, not because they disliked him, not because of personal grudges, but because he had become a threat to the structure itself. His death would be a sacrifice to preserve the system. Cold, calculated, and absolutely necessary. Now here is where Bumpy Johnson enters the story, and this is crucial to understanding the full picture. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known as Bumpy, was one of the most powerful black gangsters in Harlem during this era. Born in South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy moved to Harlem as a teenager and quickly rose through the criminal ranks. He was smart, tough, and politically savvy in ways that most gangsters weren't. Bumpy understood Harlem, understood its people, and commanded respect in the black community in ways white mobsters never could. He worked with the Italian mob, particularly with the Luciano family running numbers operations and other rackets in Harlem. But Bumpy wasn't just an employee. He was a partner, a necessary bridge between the Italian syndicates and the black community where so much profit was generated. Dutch Schultz, when he took over the Harlem numbers racket, represented an existential threat to Bumpy Johnson and the black operators who had built those businesses. Dutch came into Harlem with violence and intimidation, pushing out local operators, demanding larger cuts, treating black gangsters like servants rather than partners. There were stories of Dutch's men beating independent numbers runners, smashing operations, and generally bringing the kind of brutal disruption that killed business and destroyed relationships. Bumpy Johnson found himself caught between Dutch's aggression and the need to maintain operations that fed thousands of families in Harlem. The numbers game wasn't just criminal enterprise, it was economic infrastructure in a community starved of legitimate opportunities. Lucky Luciano saw this problem clearly. Dutch's takeover of Harlem was creating instability in one of the most profitable criminal territories in New York. More importantly, it was creating the kind of visible violence and community resentment that attracted law enforcement attention. Luciano's vision of organized crime required subtlety, cooperation, and maintaining relatively peaceful operations that didn't generate public outcry. Dutch's methods were the opposite. They were loud, brutal, and guaranteed to bring heat. So when the commission decided that Dutch had to go, Luciano saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Eliminate the threat to the commission, remove the chaos from Harlem, and strengthen the partnership with Bumpy Johnson by demonstrating that the commission valued stable, cooperative relationships over tolerating violent, disruptive bosses. There's a larger context here that matters. Lucky Luciano understood race and ethnicity as business factors, not moral or cultural absolutes. This was revolutionary for the time. Most Italian gangsters of the old guard wouldn't work with anyone outside their ethnic group. They certainly wouldn't respect black gangsters as equal partners. But Luciano was different. He had grown up with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Jewish kids who proved that talent and loyalty mattered more than ethnicity. He extended that same logic to his relationship with black gangsters like Bumpy Johnson. If you could make money, if you could maintain order, if you could be trusted, then Luciano would work with you. This wasn't idealism, it was pragmatism. But in the world of 1930s organized crime, even pragmatism was progressive. By protecting Bumpy Johnson's interests in Harlem through the elimination of Dutch Schultz, Luciano was sending several messages at once. To the commission, he was demonstrating that rules meant something and disobedience had consequences. To law enforcement, he was removing the most volatile gangster who threatened to destroy everyone with his recklessness. To Bumpy Johnson and black operators in Harlem, he was showing that the commission could be a better partner than independent violent bosses. And to the underworld at large, he was establishing that the new order he had created was permanent, structured, and willing to enforce its own laws even against powerful members. Every angle served Luciano's larger vision. Every consequence reinforced the system he had built. The contract on Dutch Schultz went to Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. This was another of Luciano's innovations. Rather than each family handling its own hits, which could create witnesses, patterns, and connections for law enforcement, Murder Inc. operated as a centralized assassination bureau. Based in Brooklyn and run by Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia, Murder Inc. carried out hits across the country for various crime families. The killers were professionals who often didn't know their victims personally, which made investigations harder. They would come into a city, do the job, and disappear. Clean, professional, efficient. This was organized crime operating like a modern corporation, with specialized departments handling specialized functions. On October 23, 1935, 3 men walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark. Charlie Workman, Mendy Weiss, and possibly a third gunman, whose identity remains disputed. Dutch Schultz was in the back room with 3 of his associates: Otto Berman, his accountant, Abe Landau, his bodyguard, and Lulu Rosenkrantz, another trusted lieutenant. The hitmen moved quickly. Gunfire erupted. Otto Berman was shot in the head and died at the scene. Abe Landau took multiple bullets but managed to stagger outside before collapsing on the sidewalk. Lulu Rosenkrantz was shot in the stomach and arm, but survived long enough to be transported to the hospital. And Dutch Schultz, who had momentarily stepped into the bathroom, was shot once in the chest at close range. The bullet tore through his liver and intestines, a wound that was fatal but not immediately so. Dutch staggered out of the bathroom, collapsed, and was rushed to Newark City Hospital, where he would linger for nearly 22 hours before death finally claimed him. But it's what happened during those 22 hours that turned Dutch Schultz from a footnote in mob history into a legend. As he lay dying, Dutch drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind fracturing under the pain and the medication and the approach of death. A police stenographer sat by his bedside, recording everything he said, hoping for a deathbed confession that might implicate other gangsters or solve crimes. What they got instead was one of the most bizarre and haunting documents in criminal history. Dutch's final words were a stream of consciousness ramble, mixing memories, paranoia, regret, and delirium into phrases that read like abstract poetry. He spoke about his mother. He spoke about money hidden in various locations. He spoke about French-Canadian bean soup. He warned about dogs biting and harmony being disrupted. He mentioned names, places, and events in a jumbled sequence that made no logical sense. The stenographer recorded phrases like, "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim," and "The chimney sweeps take to the sword," and "Please crack down on the Chinaman's friends and Hitler's commander." Dutch talked about a harmony of money existing, about his mother being the best hit, about not wanting to be a swag man. He spoke of French-Canadian bean soup and how it was a pleasure to rub his feet together. He mentioned Lulu, his dying associate, saying, "Lulu, drive me to the station." He warned, "Look out for Jimmy Valentine, for he is an old pal of mine." And perhaps most hauntingly, "Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast." These weren't the words of a man confessing his crimes. These were the words of a mind coming apart, reaching for memories and meanings that no longer connected in rational ways. For law enforcement, Dutch's final words were useless. They revealed nothing prosecutable, no hidden evidence, no confessions. But for those who study the psychology of violent men, who examine what happens when power and brutality face mortality, Dutch's last words are profound. They show a man whose entire identity was built on violence and control, completely losing both. They show someone who terrorized others for decades, reduced to babbling about his mother and French-Canadian soup. They show the ultimate powerlessness of death, which strips away everything external and leaves only the fragments of self. Dutch Schultz died on October 24, 1935, at around 8:30 in the evening. His death closed a chapter in New York organized crime and confirmed Lucky Luciano's commission as the supreme authority in the American underworld. The aftermath of Dutch's death demonstrated exactly what Luciano had predicted. There was no massive crackdown. Law enforcement investigated, but without Dutch alive to testify or provide information. The case went cold relatively quickly. Thomas Dewey continued his prosecutions, but the removal of Dutch eliminated the specific crisis that his planned assassination would have created. Harlem's numbers operations stabilized under more cooperative management, with Bumpy Johnson's position strengthened and the relationship between black operators and the Italian families improved. The commission's authority was reinforced. Every mobster in America learned a lesson that would shape behavior for generations. The commission's rules are not suggestions. Disobedience brings death. No one is too powerful to be eliminated if they threaten the structure. For Lucky Luciano personally, Dutch's elimination demonstrated his unique form of leadership. Luciano didn't kill Dutch because of personal animosity. They weren't rivals in the traditional sense. Luciano killed Dutch because Dutch represented chaos in a world Luciano was building on order. This distinction matters. Old guard mafiosi killed for pride, for disrespect, for personal slights. Luciano killed for structural reasons, for organizational necessity, for the preservation of a system bigger than individuals. This was the heart of his revolution in organized crime. He depersonalized violence and made it a tool of governance rather than emotion. In doing so, he created an organization that could outlast personalities and feuds. For Bumpy Johnson, Dutch's death was liberating. With Dutch gone, Bumpy consolidated his position as the primary black gangster in Harlem, working cooperatively with the Italian families but maintaining autonomy and respect. The relationship between Bumpy and the Luciano family, which later became the Genovese family, would last for decades. Bumpy became a bridge figure, respected in both the black community and the Italian underworld, a rare position that few achieved. His success demonstrated that Luciano's model of cooperation across ethnic lines wasn't just theoretical. It was practical and profitable. The numbers operations in Harlem continued to generate massive revenue, but now without the violent disruption that Dutch's methods had created. The decision to kill Dutch Schultz to save the commission and protect cooperative partners like Bumpy Johnson represents Lucky Luciano at his most calculating and his most visionary. He was willing to sacrifice a powerful ally because that ally had become a liability. He understood that organizations survive by enforcing rules consistently, even when enforcement is costly. He recognized that partnerships built on mutual benefit last longer than relationships built on domination. And he demonstrated that the future of organized crime belonged to those who could think systematically, who could see beyond immediate conflicts to long-term structures. These weren't lessons taught in business schools. These were insights Luciano developed from lived experience, street wisdom, and a genius for organization that surpassed most legitimate businessmen of his era. The parallels between Luciano's commission and corporate America are striking and intentional. Luciano created what was essentially a board of directors for crime. The commission held meetings, took votes, resolved disputes, allocated territories, and enforced decisions. This was unprecedented. Previous criminal organizations were personality-driven, lasting only as long as the boss lived and fragmenting immediately upon his death. Luciano's commission was designed to outlast individuals. It created stability, predictability, and rationality in an industry defined by violence and chaos. The fact that the commission survived for decades after Luciano's own imprisonment and eventual deportation proved the strength of his design. Consider what Luciano achieved in just a few years during the early 1930s. He ended a bloody war between old guard Sicilian bosses that was destroying the entire criminal underworld. He assassinated the two most powerful mafiosi in America, Masseria and Maranzano, within months of each other. He created an entirely new organizational structure that brought together families from multiple cities, ethnicities, and backgrounds. He established rules and protocols for an industry that had previously operated on pure violence and intimidation. He eliminated a powerful boss, Dutch Schultz, not because Dutch threatened him personally, but because Dutch threatened organizational stability. And he did all of this while maintaining relationships with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and while building cooperative partnerships with black gangsters like Bumpy Johnson. This wasn't just criminal genius. This was organizational genius of the highest order. But there's a darkness in this genius that can't be ignored. Every innovation Luciano created was built on violence. Every rule he established was enforced through murder. Every partnership he built was threatened by betrayal and death. The commission was designed to reduce violence, to make it strategic rather than chaotic, but it was still fundamentally an organization built on killing. Dutch Schultz's delirious final words, recorded for posterity, stand as a reminder of the human cost of this system. Whatever Dutch had been in life, however brutal and violent, he died confused, in pain, calling for his mother. The men who killed him faced no consequences. The organization that ordered his death grew stronger, and the world moved on. barely pausing to notice that another gangster had died in a pool of his own blood. Lucky Luciano himself would eventually face consequences, though not from the underworld. In 1936, exactly as he had feared, Thomas Dewey convicted Luciano on forced prostitution charges. The prosecution was controversial, with questions about coerced testimony and questionable evidence, but it worked. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for compulsory prostitution charges. He would serve almost 10 years before being released and deported to Italy in 1946 as part of a deal involving his assistance with the war effort during World War II. He never returned to America, dying in Naples in 1962 of a heart attack at age 64. But even from prison and then from exile, Luciano's influence over American organized crime remained significant. The commission continued to function. The structures he built remained in place. The revolution he started in how organized crime operated endured. Bumpy Johnson continued to operate in Harlem until his own death in 1968, maintaining his position as one of the most respected and powerful black gangsters in American history. His relationship with the Italian families, particularly the Genovese family, which descended from Luciano's organization, remained strong throughout his life. Bumpy became a mentor to younger black criminals, including Frank Lucas, and was known for his intelligence, his political awareness, and his genuine connection to the Harlem community. Unlike Dutch Schultz, who ruled through fear and extraction, Bumpy ruled through respect and mutual benefit. He embodied the type of partnership that Luciano had envisioned, proving that the commission model could work across racial lines when based on genuine cooperation rather than exploitation. The betrayal that saved Bumpy Johnson was also the betrayal that saved the entire American underworld from its own worst impulses. Dutch Schultz wanted to kill a prosecutor, an act that would have brought catastrophic law enforcement response. Lucky Luciano stopped him permanently. This decision, cold and brutal as it was, demonstrated understanding of power that went beyond simple gangsterism. Luciano understood that organized crime could only survive by staying within certain boundaries, by not provoking responses that legitimate society couldn't ignore. Killing cops occasionally might be tolerated in the corrupt landscape of Prohibition-era America. Killing a high-profile prosecutor would cross a line that no amount of bribery or corruption could paper over. Think about what this means for a moment. Lucky Luciano, a ruthless criminal who had personally been involved in numerous murders, who had betrayed and killed his own bosses, who ran prostitution rings and drug operations and violent rackets, this man understood restraint. He understood that unlimited violence was self-destructive. He understood that power requires boundaries to be sustainable. This paradox, a violent man preaching violence control, a criminal creating rules for crime, is at the heart of Luciano's legacy. He didn't make organized crime moral. He made it manageable. He didn't eliminate violence. He made it strategic. And in doing so, he created a system that would dominate American criminal enterprise for generations. Dutch Schultz's death was necessary because Dutch represented the old way, the chaotic way, the unsustainable way. He was a brilliant earner, bringing in millions through his various operations, but he had no vision beyond personal profit and survival. He couldn't see the larger picture. He couldn't understand that his individual actions had collective consequences. When the commission told him not to kill Dewey, Dutch saw them as weak, as afraid, as interfering with his business. What he couldn't see was that they were trying to save him from himself and save everyone else from his recklessness. His refusal to accept organizational authority signed his death warrant. The bullets that killed him weren't personal. They were institutional. They were the enforcement mechanism of a new order that Dutch couldn't adapt to. The poetry of Dutch's final delirious words adds a layer of tragic complexity to his story. Here was a man who built an empire, who commanded fear, who made millions, who killed without hesitation. Reduced in his final moments to babbling about French-Canadian bean soup and asking to be driven to the station. All the violence, all the money, all the power meant nothing when death came. The stenographer who recorded those words was looking for confessions and evidence. What they captured instead was something more profound and more unsettling. They captured the dissolution of a human mind, the unraveling of personality, the moment when all the structures we build to give our lives meaning simply collapse. Dutch's last words are studied today not because they reveal criminal secrets, but because they reveal human vulnerability in the face of mortality. For those who study organized crime, the Dutch Schultz hit represents a turning point. Before Dutch's death, there was still debate about whether the commission model would work, whether crime families would actually submit to collective authority, whether the old ways of personal violence and feuding would resurface. Dutch's death ended that debate. The commission had ordered the hit on a powerful boss for organizational reasons, and that hit had been carried out efficiently and without major repercussions. The message was clear: the commission was real, its authority was absolute. And anyone who challenged that authority, regardless of their wealth or power, would face the same fate as Dutch Schultz. This created a stability in organized crime that lasted for decades, with major mob wars becoming increasingly rare as the commission mediated disputes and enforced agreements. The relationship between this stability and the protection of figures like Bumpy Johnson is direct. In the chaotic world before the commission, black gangsters operated at the sufferance of whichever white mob boss controlled their territory. They could be shaken down, muscled out, or killed with impunity. The commission model, with its emphasis on stable territories and cooperative relationships, created space for talented black criminals to build lasting organizations. Bumpy Johnson's success wasn't charity from the Italian families. It was mutual recognition that Harlem's criminal economy was more profitable when operated cooperatively rather than through domination. Dutch Schultz's aggressive takeover of Harlem represented a return to the old extractive model. His death signaled that the commission preferred the new cooperative model. This wasn't racial justice, but it was pragmatic progress within a criminal context. Lucky Luciano's genius lay in recognizing these patterns before others did. He saw that ethnic cooperation would be more profitable than ethnic competition. He saw that organizational stability would outlast personal power. He saw that strategic violence was more effective than chaotic violence. He saw that some targets were too dangerous to hit, and that eliminating your own people for organizational reasons was sometimes necessary. Each of these insights ran counter to traditional mafia thinking, and each proved correct. The fact that American organized crime followed Luciano's model for decades, even while Luciano himself sat in prison and then in exile, proves how revolutionary his thinking was. But we must also reckon with what this means morally. Lucky Luciano was a criminal. He profited from prostitution, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. He ordered murders. He corrupted police and politicians. He ran operations that destroyed lives and communities. The fact that he was brilliant, that he created innovative organizational structures, that he understood business and management better than most legitimate executives, none of this changes the fundamental nature of what he did. He was a predator who preyed on human weakness and vulnerability. The system he built was designed to exploit, not to serve. The stability he created was the stability of organized exploitation. Dutch Schultz, for all his violence and crudeness, was in some ways more honest than Luciano. Dutch was openly brutal. He didn't pretend to be building something better. He took what he wanted through force and didn't apologize. Luciano, on the other hand, dressed violence in organizational language. He made exploitation systematic. He created a machine that could grind up lives efficiently and distribute the profits equitably among the machine's owners. Which is worse, the crude thug or the genius criminal organizer? History has generally been kinder to Luciano, seeing him as a visionary who brought order to chaos. But that order came at tremendous human cost, a cost that's easy to overlook when focusing on the organizational brilliance. And yet, within the moral framework of the criminal underworld, Luciano's actions were defensible. He eliminated Dutch Schultz to prevent a catastrophic law enforcement crackdown that would have destroyed countless criminals and their operations. He protected the Commission's authority to maintain stability that benefited thousands of mobsters and their families. He strengthened relationships with figures like Bumpy Johnson to create more profitable and less violent operations in black communities. These justifications only work if you accept the premise that organized crime should exist and should be managed effectively. If you reject that premise, then Luciano's innovations are simply more efficient methods of exploitation. This moral complexity is part of what makes the Lucky Luciano story endlessly fascinating. He was neither hero nor simple villain. He was a criminal genius who transformed his industry, a brutal killer who reduced violence, an exploiter who created opportunities for others within the criminal world, a visionary who spent his final years in exile, cut off from the system he built. His decision to betray Dutch Schultz was simultaneously an act of organizational necessity, strategic brilliance, and cold-blooded murder. All three things are true simultaneously. The fact that this decision saved Bumpy Johnson and stabilized Harlem's criminal economy doesn't make it good. The fact that it prevented Dutch from killing Thomas Dewey doesn't make it justified. And yet, within the logic of the world Luciano inhabited, it was the correct decision. Dutch Schultz died screaming, or at least babbling incoherently, his mind fragmenting as his body failed. His last words have been analyzed by poets, psychologists, and crime historians searching for meaning in the gibberish. Some see patterns in his delirium, hidden messages about money locations or criminal secrets. Others see pure randomness, the noise of a dying brain. What's certain is that Dutch's death confirmed everything Luciano believed about power and organization. No individual, regardless of wealth or violence or reputation, is bigger than the structure. The Commission survived Dutch's death and grew stronger. Lucky Luciano's vision became reality, enforced in blood at the Palace Chop House. The legacy of this betrayal extends far beyond 1935. It established the principle that the Commission could and would kill its own members for organizational reasons. It proved that cooperative relationships across ethnic lines were not just possible but preferable to domination. It demonstrated that strategic thinking could overcome crude violence. These lessons shaped American organized crime for generations. The Commission model spread beyond New York, influencing how criminal organizations operated in cities across America and eventually internationally. The Sicilian Mafia, the Camorra, the 'Ndrangheta, criminal organizations around the world studied and adapted Luciano's innovations. In the end, the story of how Lucky Luciano betrayed Dutch Schultz to save Bumpy Johnson is really a story about the nature of power and organization. It's about how intelligent criminals learn to think beyond personal survival to organizational survival. It's about how violence can be channeled and controlled even in the most violent industries. It's about how cooperation across traditional boundaries can be more profitable than competition and domination. And it's about how every system, even criminal systems, requires enforcement and sacrifice to function. Dutch Schultz was that sacrifice. His death bought stability. His screaming final hours recorded for posterity stand as testament to the costs of that stability. Lucky Luciano built an empire on calculated betrayals, strategic violence, and organizational innovation. The death of Dutch Schultz was just one betrayal among many, but it was perhaps the most significant. It proved that the commission was real, that its rules meant something, and that no one was immune from its judgment. For Bumpy Johnson, that betrayal was salvation, removing a brutal oppressor and creating space for more equitable partnerships. For the underworld, that betrayal was a lesson that shaped behavior for generations. And for Dutch Schultz, that betrayal was death, confusion, and final words that echo through history as a reminder of what becomes of those who cannot adapt to changing times. Power doesn't just flow to the violent or the wealthy. Power flows to those who understand organization, who can create systems bigger than themselves, and who are willing to sacrifice anyone, even allies, when the system demands it. Lucky Luciano understood this better than anyone. Dutch Schultz never learned, and that difference determined who died screaming and who shaped history.